Okay, welcome everyone. This is the first of many live stream that we're planning to do in the next couple of weeks. So my name is Adnan. I'm a content evangelist at Quixel. I still don't know what that means, to be honest. And yeah, today we're going to be focusing around the post-apocalyptic environment that my colleague Josh Powers did. Now, although we're going to be focusing on, how to build a post-apocalyptic environments and yada yada, the goal of these live streams is really to help everyone, whether you're an aspiring environment artist or someone who has already started working in the industry, kind of get certain questions answered. So if you have any questions, not even related to post-apocalyptic environments, but to, how can I do this in this workflow? Or do you have some tips and tricks, maybe even on your first days, you could say, when starting up in a studio and so on, just ask your questions and we'll be here to answer. So with that out of the way, I'll give the mic to Josh Powers.
Thank you. How you doing, everyone? So we're just going to go over this post-apocalyptic street scene here. Honestly, one of the things I wanted to touch on right off the bat is that the scene itself is pretty simplistic in terms of the overall environment. As you can see, it's just the street and sidewalk mostly and a little bit of grass areas. And the focus on this environment is more on the details. And a lot of the details, there are a couple of shots, there's just a tremendous amount that I was able to put down. And like I said in the breakdown video, most of almost everything in here was sent over from the Megascans library. There are a couple things that I obviously did with custom geometry, like the street and the environment itself, as well as some new textures that I created inside Mixer, which we'll go over that in a little bit later to kind of break down those mixes a little bit more than what was shown in the breakdown video. One of the things that I did with this scene, and this is kind of new to me because most of the time that I've made environments, I kind of make them for more playable spaces. So everything in the scene is going to be detailed and kind of laid out so that if a player was running around, each nook and cranny would have the details and would be kind of finished. Whereas this is more of, I guess, kind of like a cinematic scene or just illustrations. And so I set up cameras ahead of time with the angles that I wanted, and then I kind of detailed the environment based on those angles. So if I jump out of the camera here, you can see that a lot of the environment is actually not detailed out. It's just kind of like the shots where I knew that I was going to be putting this in. So like I said, kind of new to me, but it was a lot of fun and allowed me to really just focus on particular areas rather than detailing out a lot of stuff that wasn't going to end up being in the scene. So like I said, a lot of this, almost everything was Megascans, which is great because honestly, I really enjoy putting together the scene, and it's just kind of like. I think Victor mentioned it in his Dust 2 breakdown. It's just like playing with Legos and having the assets already created and being able to just quickly bring them in from Bridge with the Live Link importer. Just lets me not have to worry about like hooking up a bunch of materials and shaders and the little details like LODs and things like that. And it lets me just bring them in, have an asset to work with, and then I could just start laying it down. So that I can really just focus on the artistic side of things and not have to worry so much about little technical things that will slow down the creative process. One of the things that I wanted to talk about that actually I learned from Victor not too long ago, and as a really great tip was, if I go back to the main camera here, he talked about something that I think he referred to it as like the gradient detail fall off, and he referred to like having a lot of detail towards, in this case, towards the bottom and the top of the camera angle, and then it just slowly falls off as it gets further into the street. And I think this is a really great idea because it really helped gives your eye direction, your eye a path for your eye to follow. And as you get more towards the middle of the street here, you still have details, grass and rocks and some debris and things like that. But it's not going to be so heavy that your eye has nowhere to rest. Your eyes are going to find places that they can stop and look at it without it being too chaotic. But you also still have a lot of the realism and a lot of the overgrowth and things like that towards the bottom and top of the screen. And it's obviously, as you can see, it's pretty noisy and busy, and there's a lot of detail going on. But it's not, that kind of detail isn't everywhere in the scene, which is really good for the eyes, because if it was everywhere, then you would just, your eyes would not stop moving. You'd have nowhere really to focus on. So I thought that was a really cool way to make sure that you had a proper blend of detail on a smaller level, and then kind of like a broader level detail, and not be overkill on one or the other. And like I said, there's the scene focus is really about the details, because there wasn't a lot of a quote environment to work with just being a sidewalk and a street. What I was kind of going for here was like, okay, I want to make this look like it's really, really densely packed with things, and overgrowth mostly, and damage, and kind of weathered environments over the years of abuse, and nobody to maintain it. And so you're going to get a lot of the pebbles, and you're going to get a lot of overgrowth and things like that. So, that was kind of like the key for me on this, was to focus on that. And so like as you get down closer, you can really start to see some of the pebbles, and I'll be honest, there's a lot of areas I probably could have pulled back on in terms of efficiency and performance and things like that, that didn't need to be there. But it is, for some of these camera angles, it was necessary, especially for this drone shot. I can go to that camera angle in a minute. But when you add those details in there, you start to really get to a believable environment. So those details are really what matter, and that's kind of what I focused on in this.
Yeah, so we have a question here about, whether you could make an environment like this one in Unity or Unreal, and how they both compare. And I think, Josh, actually, you made a really, what might be the best comparison actually video I've ever seen out there of Unreal Engine and Unity. And if you were to make this environment, say, for a game instead of just a cinematic, I think that it's really just up to you and your preferences. The industry, I think, in general, is at a point where all game engines just look really good. I personally have a preference here and there for Unreal, because shaders and so on, but it's just up to what you want to do and your experience in general. I'll link the video of Josh in the description as well, just in case you want to see it.
Yeah, actually, one of the first things that I did when I joined with Quixel was to work with Unity, and making some demonstration levels with some of the Megascans assets inside Unity. And I got to say, Unity has come a long, long way from when I first used it. Their rendering engine, especially the new HD rendering pipeline that they've implemented over the last year or so, has really helped bring it up to much closer to Unreal. There are definitely some tools in Unreal that I still prefer, like you said. There's just some things that are a little bit easier to work with and a little bit more refined. But I know that Unity is working on that actively. Things like they actually have added a node-based material editor that it's more of a shader editor, I guess, because you still make the shader, and then it's still kind of like the old school materials that Unity uses, but it's much easier to use and to get custom materials that beforehand you would have had to know, like Python or C# or something like that to really be able to make those materials work. So
it has another question.
Oh, go ahead.
No, finish first.
Oh, I was just saying it has come a long way, and honestly, my approach wouldn't be all that different either way. I might take advantage of some of Unreal's some of the features that they have that will help make this polished a little bit more. But in general, as far as construction goes, the levels that I actually did make in Unity were pretty similar. They were very heavy in detail, and it rendered very well.
Yeah, so this question was actually really interesting. Um, are there actually AAA game titles that use Quixel in any way? So hasn't been released yet, but we're working on a show reel that we're gonna share with you guys soon. Top secret information, but yeah, to this day, you can probably any game you're going to be playing right now uses Megascan, whether it's Red Dead Redemption, Metro, Destiny 2, if I remember correctly, Monster Hunter, or if you're watching The Lion King. And yeah, most entertainment mediums out there use Megascans these days. And I haven't seen much titles actually that go no Megascan at all, especially over the last 2 years and so on.
Yeah, and it totally makes sense to do that because I mean, there's so many choices in the library, and they're the types of things that you need to look really good, but it's the type of thing that there's a lot of that you
Yeah.
need to generate a lot of, and that costs a lot of money to hire artists just to make those types of things. So being able to just quickly grab them from the Megascans library is super helpful, and they're all photo real and accurate with the PBR. So that's yeah, I've been seeing a lot more of them used in games even without knowing a list. I might see them and go, oh yeah, that looks like.
Yeah, definitely. And I think something that a lot of people are not aware of when they're subscribed to the Megascans library is that the assets that we published on day one are still like high quality AAA, whatever extravagant the title you want to get ready. Like they're PBR compliant, the LODs are really good, everything is ready for you to use. So if you see something new in the library, it doesn't mean that, oh, the old one is, deprecated. Like it's kind of constantly being upgraded, of course. But when you find assets that are like 3 years or 4 years old, just download them because they have the same quality and they look just as good as all the recent stuff that you're seeing in the library. And we're constantly updating whenever you find random issues as well.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I'll kind of hop back to the scene and just kind of finish up what I was talking about with the details. I really, it's really fun to like be able to paint in all this detail and to drop all these details down on the ground. I would just find myself lost adding this stuff and kind of looking at photo reference and trying to find ways to make it more believable. And what does the ground outside look like even now? Not, like in a not post-apocalyptic setting, you're still going to see cigarette butts and leaves and garbage and things like that. And so it's really incredible how far game engines have come and real-time rendering has come to be able to have this kind of detail down. And it's still, and this is in the editor, so I'm not even running in a game, and I have all this overhead, and it's still running at a very reasonable frame rate, and all of it in real time. So it's just it's a lot of fun, and it's really helped bring up real time to the next level of rendering because like with decals in the breakdown video I talk about how decals really do help bring your scene to life, but without the supporting geometry of things like rocks and garbage and things like that, you really start to have a breakdown of the texture maps. Like textures can only go so far, and so like as you get with like more of these glancing angles, if I were to remove these, then all of a sudden that starts to kind of lose its appeal a little bit on this lower level. But when you add those back in, you really get this sense of depth and realism that just that you can't really get with textures alone, because as you get to that that really steep angle, low camera angle, you're really going to you're going to need those silhouette changes that you get with the geometry, and so it was a lot of fun to detail out this scene because like I said, that was the focus. It was like, hey, building a street scene, the street and the sidewalks itself is pretty simplistic, but the challenge comes in with adding the detail, and it's not just a matter of like slapping stuff down. but you're going to want to make sure that the detail makes sense, because just adding detail just for the detail turns into noise. And it's kind of like what I was talking about when from the main shot here, and kind of having that fall off. If you're just putting stuff down, it's going to really start to like, it looks detailed and it looks busy, but if it doesn't make sense, then it starts to kind of pull away from the believability aspect. And that was actually like something, some feedback I got for the train was, hey, make sure to have kind of this flow of garbage, and that you get this build up and stack up of garbage over here, so that it's not just kind of all over the place. And so as the water, and as far as the backstory of the scene goes, the water might be running down this way and it's pushing the garbage to the drain, and then it's getting caught up on the drain, and you're getting a little bit of the pooling here. You're getting all this garbage actually just getting stopped up by other garbage, and you have like a directionality to the garbage, which really helped add a level of believability to that shot, rather than just having garbage placed all over the area, and then it just kind of feels like, okay, it's there and that's cool, but it's not really feeling like what I would see in the real world. So that was definitely important little detail to add to the scene. And that kind of goes into something else I want to talk about is getting feedback is so important. I don't know how many people are like me, but I tend to want to go towards getting an asset or a scene or whatever as close to finish as I can before I show it. And that's because, it's just me. I just go, I want somebody to see something that's closer to final, and then they'll give feedback, because when when I show them something closer to final, I'm not feeling as quite as vulnerable, or like, like they're not going to really understand what I'm going to go for here in the end. I want them to see the complete picture. But the problem with that is that you start to get feedback that's really good, but here's a change you can make that would really make this a lot better. But then you realize that you have to undo hours and hours of work to implement that because you didn't get feedback early on. So, and that's something like even over here with this this little manhole cover, it actually was a decal initially, and we had some back and forth and some feedback, and it was decided, hey, and just adding a little bit of a geometry height to the lip here would really help make this pop a little bit more. And we did some back and forth on it and tried to to use some different techniques to see which would look better. And it was just really a really quick process to finally decide, okay, adding some geometry here would actually be the best bet. And so feedback is it's so important. So if you have the ability to get that, whether you're posting on our forum or another art forum, or you're if you're in school, or you're actually in you're working in a professional environment, make sure you're always getting feedback early on too, like even in the blockout stages, because a lot of that stuff that might be a headache later on to address could easily be fixed early on. As long as you have some eyes on it other than yours, because it's just so easy to kind of get locked into tunnel vision and not be able to see the forest through the trees at times.
Yeah, and we have actually a really good Discord server where a bunch or a huge amount of people from the Quixel community and other people who work at Quixel and so on, who are just there available to give you feedback whenever you want. So Jin is gonna post a link in a few seconds, hopefully. And yeah, you guys are free to join in, ask a few questions about mix or whatever. And before I give the mic back to Josh, there was a question about whether we're gonna have emissive support in Mixer. Yes, not only emissive support, but also opacity map support, and yeah, lots of great stuff happening in Mixer, and we're excited to showcase that to you guys as soon as we can. Yep.
So like I was saying before, kind of getting back to the details and the geometry versus decals. Obviously there are cases where geometry just doesn't make sense. I mean, we can do displacement, and we can do all sorts of crazy stuff like for these cracks and things like that. But in a practical development, production development environment, you're not going to be able to do that kind of like displacement is very expensive, and so you're going to want to use that where it really is going to be necessary. So we do have situations where it's like, hey, you got the decal here, it's cracked. Yeah, it's not going to hold up as good when it's on that really low angle shot. But in most cases, you're going to be the camera's going to be above a player or in a first person view, and these won't be too bad at all. But it's just not really practical to have geometry or even just displacement geometry for things like cracks. But where it makes sense to have some geometry for instead of a decal, I definitely would suggest doing it. There's a situation like over here where I had this was just using an atlas texture initially, but because of the shot, and we knew it was like a low shot, we wanted to have this paper kind of like, because it's wet, drooping down into the to the slats of the drain here, and just kind of add another depth of realism here. But again, if this was just a regular environment where a character's running around, that's not probably the type of detail you'd want to add to the scene, because it is it is adding a little bit of geometry, poly count. As you can see, I just basically took a plane, I applied the texture to it, and then in this case, I think I went into ZBrush and I just kind of sculpted it between the little slots on the drain, and then I just did a decimation run on it and then brought it back in with the texture applied. So for like cinematics or illustration type shots, this totally makes sense. For something that's more of a, you're going to ship this level because it's part of a game, and you're going to have a character that's running around, they're never going to necessarily, they're not going to look at that type of stuff unless they're like me and I just sit there and stare at the environment and drive people crazy that are waiting for me to play the game. But it's the kind of detail that really adds a lot, but it's not always practical to do. But in a situation where I think I have some like these rags, I just took I took the height map actually from the Megascans library for this particular asset, and then I put it into ZBrush and I extracted a bit of a depth to it, and then I decimated it. And then this was just a way, like, this is something I would totally do in production, where I just want a little bit of depth and height to this asset, and instead of it just being flat, because something like this, a cloth, you can use it as a decal, but it's always better to have a little bit of geometry supporting it so that it doesn't feel like it's just flat when you get some of those glancing angles. So this was definitely an area that I use that, and there's a couple of spots that I use something like that, and it's really easy to do, honestly. So it's not too heavy in polys. Oops, not that.
So we have a question here,
Sure.
which is actually a really good one, from one Witam1. In my portfolio, I have many scenes done with Megascans. I recently got a job offer from 2K Vegas, and at first I felt bad because I used assets, but I think that's how it goes these days. So this is actually a question that I really wanted to reply to before you even ask. There's always this question about, oh, am I gonna, did I actually make this rock, or did I actually make asset A or B? If you're an artist, I don't think, in my opinion, your vision should be limited to, oh, nice, I love how I have, like some small wet leaves or whatever just all over my rock. You should think about the bigger picture, about the environment. Obviously, if you're going to apply for a prop artist and in your portfolio or resume you say, I know how to make props, then you should market props that you've made. However, if what you're trying to do is build environments, then assets are just small elements in the bigger picture. It's in the 90s, you didn't have prop artists, for instance. You didn't have surface artists. You had a few artists in a team who actually built everything because they didn't have to worry about the details. And the only reason why the industry these days actually has like hundreds of people dealing with all of these small issues is because you have to model every single small detail. If you have a leaf somewhere in your game, you have to make sure that you painted or drew the veins on the leaf, that it has like all the proper roughness values. Maybe it displaces based on the wind and so on. That leaf might be somewhere in your game and most likely doesn't contribute to the end product at all. And that's why it's so important to actually focus on, okay, here's my composition, here's an environment. And when you look at a game like Red Dead Redemption, for instance, or Metro or whatever, they used a lot of photogrammetry, procedural workflows, and so on. You actually don't notice that. No one stops and says, oh God, this is so much photogrammetry, or this is so much proceduralism. It's just, this is such a beautiful game. And that really, I think, as artists should be our focus, not, what technique am I using, but am I actually making great art?
Yeah, I mean, my first job in the industry was in 2005, and I was hired on as a prop artist. And so even that far back, we've been starting to kind of separate the roles of an artist, an environment artist, because like you said, back in the 90s, it was like, hey, you wanted a level built, you pretty much built it yourself, everything. And so we started to see separation into different roles, at least in the early 2000s, and that's even been separated even further since, like material artists specifically and things like that. But, that when I transitioned from props to environment art, I still would build, the environments, like kind of like this, the sidewalk or the street. I would still be doing stuff like that. But a lot of my role was just assembling the scene. I was set dressing, and I had to have props to do that. So, yeah, I mean, when you're wanting to do something in the environment art realm, pretty much a lot of the times these days, you're gonna just be taking assets that have already been created by other artists, whether they're photogrammetry or whether they've been outsourced to a studio, or whether the person next to you in the next office over has been making them. You're gonna most likely be provided those assets anyways, and then you're just gonna be making the environment look really, really nice with the assets that they've created. And that's not to say that you shouldn't be prepared to make your own content, because that's inevitable. But yeah, I mean, when you're assembling a really good scene, it's not just about the assets that are in it. It's about the composition and the lighting and how much you thought through where to place each thing, and that is so important. That's just as important as having really good looking assets that are in the scene. So
Yeah. And usually making a prop is relatively easy when you compare it to making an environment that has good lighting and good composition. But even if you're painting, for instance, the challenge, or you always express yourself artistically within how, like the framing, the composition, the lighting, the shading, even sometimes. Once you actually master those skills, that's where you actually start building really great environments. And if you look at the breakdowns that we released for this video and a bunch of others, like Cyberpunk, New York, Abandoned Street Alleyways, we have a bunch of them coming in the next few weeks. All of them don't go into super detail showing you like, here's what a decal is, how to place it. The goal here is just to show you how environments are built, because we really believe that everyone can do environments like this. You just got to be used to, seeing how artists who work with workflows like this work, and get more inspiration on, asset placement, composition, lighting, and so on. So yeah.
yeah, totally. I think that just looking at other games, looking at illustrations, looking at even films, because I mean, real time and films are getting so close together. But just looking at those things for like learning what is good composition, what's a good way to make your camera angle really attractive and eye catching. and things like that are going to apply to a lot of environment art. Even when you're in a situation where the player is in control, there are times where you're going to be able to funnel the player in, into kind of a corridor or something, and you can more or less frame shots. And so having all that information as an environment artist is just as important as learning, just where to place props and adding lights and VFX and things like that. So, okay, so what do you think? You want to go to Mixer and kind of break down some of the materials?
Yeah,
okay.
Let's go there.
Let me hop over to Mixer here. So I went over this a little bit in the breakdown video itself, but we just kind of wanted to talk a little bit more about the thoughts behind the layers. And this is my base layer, which tiled over most of the road. I painted on some secondary and tertiary textures to just add a little bit of variation to break it up. But like I said in the breakdown, I wanted to have the base texture be pretty generic, just so that it wasn't overly repetitive in any of the shots. So I kept it pretty sans detail. I mostly honestly just used a couple of different layers to break up some of the repetitiveness, repetition, and then just like this first one, very very subtle, but then I started getting some repeating patterns here, so I added another one to kind of get rid of that. So now we have something that's feeling pretty generic, and then I added another one, just again adding some weathering. I didn't want it to be too plain Jane. I didn't want it to be something that was like uninteresting, but again, I didn't want to have unique details because it would be covering most of the road itself, you'd look at it and go, okay, I see that texture repeat there. And then this last one, I actually kind of probably overwrote most of the layers beneath it. Would consider tweaking it a little bit, but I think it worked out in the end, where it allowed me to have something visually interesting with some of these cracks, but none of them really stood out in the scene as something that was obviously tiling over and over. So that was kind of like the thought behind the base one, and then I'll load up the another one. And basically, with the other one, I just took the one that I just showed you. I duplicated it and saved it as a new file, and then I added layers on top of that. I did move the little cracked scan that I had, I think higher up in the stack, but I just started adding some damage stuff, and honestly, I grabbed this is probably concrete, so you don't have to use scans or surfaces that are specific to the material you're trying to make. So you can get a lot of mileage out of things. So this is concrete instead of asphalt, but most people aren't going to notice that. You're not going to notice that by the end. And then this was just more of the same. I think you can see that I used the same scan several times, but I would change rotation, probably offset, things like that. And then I also added masks using the mask stack, and it looks like mostly just used a noise to kind of mask out the areas that this scan would show through. And so just kind of layered that several times to get just kind of get this overall beat up and worn down texture here, using a mixture of the rotations, offset, and then using a noise modifier to mask out these areas. And then that's when I added the kind of cracks back in from the first one, but I made them a little bit more pronounced. And then I don't even know if I actually used that in the end, but that's just like some dust and kind of dirt. This is just an actual decal that I don't have it going to the edges, because if you're using a decal and you scale it up to the edges, it won't be seamless like the surfaces. So I kept that more in the middle, and you can see that it just kind of blends in nicely. And then I added the liquid layer, which is this here. And that just gives you nice, really nice looking details that add a really great reflectance breakup to the road itself. And since this scene was supposed to look like it had maybe just recently rained or something like that, it just made sense to add that. And I think I mentioned in the breakdown video that the blend material from LiveLink does allow you to paint in puddles, but with this, I really wanted a lot of control where the puddles were going to show up, and having them be in just like in these specific cracks and kind of divots dug out of the road. And so I just made all this stuff happen inside Mixer instead of using the vertex blend material. So, and then I added another decal. Go ahead.
Yes, before we go on to the decals, about the water puddles, I just wanted to expand on the workflows that you could use. For instance, if you want to choose between, do I go with vertex painting or maybe even a texture mask, or again making everything as one texture? That really depends on what you want to do. For instance, if you want it to be art directed within your game, maybe you're just going to have a base asphalt and actually export the base asphalt with maybe one or two variations, and in Unreal use the live link to paint the water in specific directions, and that's quite cool. However, your road is going to need to have a bunch of polygons for you to really be able to have the edges controlled quite well, because otherwise you always have weird transitions here and there between vertex distances. The other solution is to have a mask. This is similar to what Epic did with a boy and his kite. I think that's what their demo is called, where you have a splat map for a terrain. A splat map is like a giant texture with a specific color, like red, that tells the engine, okay, I want you to scatter grass on all the areas that are red. In this case, you can do, okay, I want you to scatter, I want you to paint water and add grass at the edges of my water whenever you find a gray mask or red mask. So there's all sorts of workflows. Just depends on what you want to do, like terrain or prop or small scene.
Right. Yeah, you can use, there's a lot of different techniques. You can get height map blending, which is kind of effectively what's going on here is, you're using the height map data to control where the puddles are showing up. And so you can do some of that in some terrain materials. You can set that up so that you build a like a height map mask, and it will help transition those puddles to be a little bit more in the they'll show up first in the divots and the concave areas, and then as you paint heavier on it, it'll bleed out further. So there are alternatives for that for sure. In this case, I knew what like the scope of my scene was pretty limited, and I had just the very specific angles that I had chosen, and so I wanted to be able to really fine tune that like a Canon mixer and really have that transition, everything about it be physically accurate, and have that kind of total control over it versus you even with the height masks, you do get a little bit of interpretation from the engine for what it, how it should be blending. So I like having a lot more control over a situation like this, and so it just made more sense excuse me, to put that in Mixer instead of doing that through the vertex blending. And so the last thing, the last layer that I added was just like a little bit of a rubble detail. It's a decal as well, I believe, or it may not be actually, but I did the same thing with the mask. I added a noise. You can see that by turning that off, it's not that it looks bad. It's just it was a little too heavy-handed for what I wanted, and so I just added a kind of a low frequency, high amplitude noise so that some of the areas were just a little bit less heavy. Because what I knew what I was going to be doing was that this rubble detail, the gravel, was more of a supplement to the scattered geometry that I was going to put down. So it just, I didn't want to go too heavy-handed on it, and then have the geometry get painted down on top of that, and then it just got really noisy and busy. This, so I just kind of kept that a little easier on the by using the mask instead of just leaving it off and having it tile full. So yeah, that was kind of it for the materials. I did the same thing for the sidewalk. I actually made, I don't have the mixes here on the computer, but the sidewalk was just built the same way. I just built kind of a tile, and then I tiled them onto the geometry. Let me open up Unreal again. I tiled them onto this geometry here, and then I literally would just go in and cut out the squares and would extrude them or crack them or things like that, just to kind of get some variation, especially with let's see, I think it's this one. Yeah, you can. It adds a lot more a visual interest to the sidewalk than just having a plain tile texture.
We have a question here. Josh, are you a 3D artist, which you are, and is it easy or not to find work in the industry?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think that the industry is always looking for talented artists. It is, it's a saturated industry right now because, schools are really starting to focus a lot of programs on game development, a lot more so than when I first started. So I think there's definitely a lot more interest and a lot more people aware that this is a very thriving career path. But I think that there's always more work than artists because as the industry has grown, you're seeing more people that are going out and doing their own indie projects, or they're funding their own games. And even if there's not necessarily as much in-house work, I think there's probably more than ever a lot of demand for freelance and for off-site remote artists. So I mean, in my opinion, that as the games get more detailed, like we're seeing with Unreal and the scene, and being just so heavy in the detail, as games get bigger and more detailed, the demand for artists goes up because they still want to hit the same timelines that they had with earlier games, but now the expectations of the visual quality bar are through the roof. So the timeline doesn't change, but the amount of content does. So as that grows, I think there's always a need for the artists.
Yeah, and I think two things. The first one, I feel like a lot of artists these days, they have like a super specific dream of, I only want to work as an artist working on Overwatch cinematic team, creating character X, like super specific stuff, and targeting like some of the highest companies out there. Even though there are thousands of indie companies out there, hundreds of game studios, and even beyond the game industry, you have the VR industry and AR industry, which are booming. You have virtual production, which is, I think, one of the most promising industries in the foreseeable future when it comes to CGI. And there are just so many domains, and it all comes down to how granular you want to be, how much your focus is going to be. And when it comes to on a personal level, you just have to stand out. If you want to be a prop artist, and you want to actually, for instance, model your props, don't just make 3 guns like every other prop artist has, and then be sad when no one sends you a job offer. You really gotta stand out, because like Josh said, the industry is kind of weird because it's saturated, but so many companies are actually looking for people. Like at Quixel, we're hiring, by the way, we're hiring a lot of artists right now. And it's kind of hard and easy at the same time. It's hard to explain, to find the right people. So just stand out, make sure that you're not yet another artist, because I don't think when you join the industry, in your mind you're saying, man, I can't wait to be just another artist. You want it to be unique, and you just got to work hard enough to be unique.
Yeah, the opportunity's there. That's kind of what I was trying to say, is that the opportunity's there, but it doesn't mean that that you're guaranteed to get something, because Just because the opportunity is there doesn't mean that somebody's just going to hire you because you know how to make something in 3D and you know how to use and navigate Unreal. Definitely, like you said, focus on standing out, because when you stand out, then that's when people want to start talking to you. And I know several people that just happened to post something that they finished. They didn't think anything of it. They just were like, hey, I'm going to post this. This will be cool. And it went viral, basically. It blew up. And then all of a sudden, big name companies are reaching out to them saying, hey, I'd really like to have you on my team. And it's making sure that you're getting visibility, and like ArtStation is a great place to do that. But it's also a difficult place to do that because there are so many talented artists on there. It's just amazing how much talent is out there. And so, like Adnan said, you gotta make yourself look unique, so that when your work comes across somebody's screen, they're going to be like, oh, that's interesting, and they're going to want to click on it, and then they'll want to click on your profile and see the rest of your work. And if you just have those same 3 guns or a crate or something like that, that's usually going to cause somebody to say, oh, okay, I'm pass. But if you got some really great, interesting looking things, then that's going to make them have want to bookmark your page and come back to it later with a few other people.
Yeah, and we have 2 questions here, and then I think it would be interesting to talk about the setup to have your light, actually, which is the second question. So the first one is, with foliage and grass, is everything already set up and easy to use from Bridge? Yes, I guess you just hit export in Bridge, and can I actually paint on Josh's screen? Yeah, you're gonna have all your different plans available in Unreal's Foliage Painter. So it's literally click export and start painting. The second question is for you, Josh. How do you approach the lighting in your scene and using the right cube map for HDRI maps in Unreal? Cheers.
Okay, so I'll address. I also want to touch on the foliage real quick. The only thing that is not exported straight from Bridge is these little guys here, and that's because I wanted a very specific kind of straight line to fill in between like the cracks between sidewalk segments, and for like these little stretches of the grass tufts growing out of the crack decals. I just wanted to have something like that. So I took the grass asset from Megascans, and then I took them into Moto, which is, you can use Maya, Moto Max, whatever. And then I just positioned them to be in a straight line. So it's effectively the same asset, but I did modify it a little bit to fit my needs. So, but otherwise, the plants, all that stuff came out of the library. As far as the lighting goes, it's really complicated. It's a single dynamic directional light. And that's all I used in this particular scene. I do have a skylight to kind of fill in, get some of the blues and the shadows, and fill in some of the darker areas. And then honestly, I used a fair amount of cube maps, especially like in shots like this. I have several cube maps, and again, this is way overkill for general production. This is not something I would do for a level that the character's going to run around in. And honestly, even if this was like for a cinematic for a game, I would probably talk with a tech artist to get a better solution for this. But we were getting some low resolution reflections here initially, and my camera angle wasn't quite low enough for the screen space reflections. So I was getting kind of blurry reflections, and so we ended up using a lot of reflection probes here to give me a little bit higher resolution on that. I do not have the computer I built this on was not rated to handle RTX, so I couldn't use RTX either, which was a bummer. But at the same time, it was cool to build something that was a little bit older, like something detailed like this that was on an older machine, and have it still work. But that's how I did that with the cube maps. In general, I just kind of kept them reasonably spaced apart. This may still even be overkill for some game environments, but I wanted to have a pretty reasonable reflection probe count on this, since it was more for just illustration and cinematic type stuff.
Yeah. And if you want to know more about RTX, just tune in and stay tuned in the next couple of weeks, because we have a really, really impressive demo by Quixel's Victor Eman, who's going to be showing you guys like a really great surprise. So stay tuned for that.
Yes, that will be a fun one for sure. So let's see. I think, yeah, somebody also asked were the decals from the library. Pretty much yes. There's a little bit of a side note on that I did take some of the decals and alter them a little bit, make some adjustments, maybe in Photoshop or something like that to just make them match the colors of especially the asphalt a little bit more closely. But other than that, they were I didn't make any like really custom decals or anything. A lot of that stuff was just from straight out of library. So and then
go on.
No, go ahead.
Yes, just can you expand a little bit on the use of shadows in the scene to kind of help drive the composition and the lighting as well?
Well, that's funny, because that's actually what I was saying, getting ready to transition to. So basically with this shot, again, because it was since it was so limited, I didn't have the rest of the environment to cast shadows. So I mean, over here we have a little bit of, you can see a little bit of a building or something, some bricks here. I literally just took a box. Let me jump out of here. Yeah, I mean, I just took a box primitive in Unreal and applied the texture to it just because it was in the scene just enough. It was mostly for a shadow caster, but it was, I literally just threw a box in, and then I made kind of like a pitched roof. Didn't even bother throwing material on it because it was never going to be seen. Same thing with these trees here. I actually, I didn't have any trees, and so my colleague Robin Albertson was kind enough to send me a few trees that he put together, and so I just threw them into the scene because I wanted the shadow casters. I wanted the ability to have something to kind of break up the road, because without them, it was really bright, and there was no real contrast to the scene because the directional light just didn't have anything stopping it. So I think that really added, especially for this kind of main shot here, it added a lot of visual interest to the reflectance of the road, and just made the scene feel a lot more lively and believable, because most suburban neighborhoods and things like that are going to have small trees in the front yards and things like that. And without that it wasn't just there should be trees or something, but it also really helped kind of tone down the intensity of the sunlight in the scene. So that was really helpful. And then having like a little stop sign and things like that really just really helped tone down the lighting a little bit. And then I mean, just another little thing that I've done before. Maybe some people think that this is not a good idea or a good solution, but one thing that I do is, especially if I have like grass and vegetation inside shadows, I will sometimes create a shadow version of the material, and I basically just duplicate it. And then this is just using a master material made by the LiveLink importer. And one of the things it has is a color overlay. So I can actually go in and start adjusting the value on this and make it brighter or darker. And so I tend to make things that, if I have a lot of things that are going to be in shadows and they all kind of have that, little bit too bright look to them, I'm sure that there's probably better solutions if you're going to do this a lot rather than making a bunch of duplicates. But I do like being able to just have an option to drag and drop a custom shadowed version of the material onto my meshes, so that I can make them feel a little bit more like they're in the shadows, rather than having them full bright and kind of getting some weirdness that looks great when it's in the spotlight, when it's supposed to be in the spotlight. or in directional light, sunlight, whatever. But if it's in a shadow, it might be a little too bright of a value, and so you'll want to be able to be able to play with that so that you can tone that down a little bit so that it feels like it's a little bit more blended into a shadowed environment.
We have a question here. Does tiling become an issue with material blends that causes problems when you have a lot of blended materials? Yes, do you want to answer that, Josh?
So, I mean, whenever you have, I assume you're talking about like if is it going to be a problem to have too many blends or too many tile textures?
Yeah, I guess just to distill the problem, if you were to export like 4 different road variations from Mixer to Unreal and then trying to blend them, yeah, do you start having repetition problems, for instance, and does tiling become an issue?
I mean, not. I mean, as if you've got more textures to choose from, you definitely are going to get less tiling, and in my experience, and so, and honestly, with the power of decals, it's becoming less of an issue. Like I try to avoid having, like, I want to make the terrain, whether it's a grassy terrain or a road or whatever, I want to try to make that look as good as I can without decals, because I know then with decals added on, it's only going to look better. But with decals, it's really easy to cover repetition. It's really easy to hide that. Even just adding some light grunge can really take your eyes off of the repeating patterns and you see something different. Even if you get up close and you study the texture and you can see, oh yeah, that pattern is repeating, as a whole scene, those patterns become less obvious with decals, especially things like when you have like a completely abrupt change in the texture, like the these whether it's like potholes or patches, things like that. I mean, this stuff really takes away the repetition of tiling textures, because you're able to just put these things down wherever you want, project them down, and it makes it such a huge difference. So like I said, I try to just make sure that I have it as little repetition as possible as a base, and then I just tile on or I stack on decals on top of that.
And I think we only have 3 minutes left, but I feel like we've only been streaming for like 20 minutes or something.
It's gone by fast.
Yeah. The question: when will you guys add trees to the Megascans library? We're working like crazy on it. I know some of the brightest minds in the industry are working on it as we speak, as in right now. And yeah, no ETA to give. Just know that whatever trees we're gonna release, we don't want it to be just like, oh nice, a duplicate generic tree. We want it to be the best looking trees out there. So just stay tuned for that, and I'm pretty hyped about it as well. Yeah. Is every object in the scene static for baking the light for performance?
Yeah, I mean everything is set up to bake, but I'm just using a dynamic light. But like all the meshes are static. I know that the foliage stuff isn't quite set up the same way as a basic static mesh, or I believe so. I think they might be lit a little differently. But as far as like the actual props and the environment, everything is set up to be ready to bake.
Perfect. All right. I think that's pretty much it. Are you guys also going to scan the moon and other planets for surfaces? Eddie is a very ambitious guy, so I think that's probably somewhere in the roadmap. And yeah, I think the live stream is pretty much done. We have a lot of great environments again coming up in the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned for that. This was a great live stream. Great work, Josh, and everyone who helped in support. And yeah, let's tune in next week, Friday, same time for another live stream, and Tuesday next week as well for another amazing video. So yeah, see you guys. Thanks.
Thank you.